Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Mino e tātou, let's pray. I te atua, mana ki ti e mātou, I tēnei po. Mō e mātou whai whakaro katoa, Amen. Nā mai haere mai, ki te whare wānanga o ngā toa whakaora. Ngā me inui ki a koutou katoa. He mihi hoki ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe, me te marae o orongo mai. Tēnā koutou I ngā rangatira o te opi whakaora, I ngā hoa hai, Colonel Heather Roro, and our own principal, Major Michelle Collins. He mihi whakawhetai, mō tō koutou mahi rangatira. He mihi mahana tēnei ki tō mātou kai kōrero I tēnei pō, nō mai I Dr. Andrew Shepherd. Kia ora te mihi ki a koe, mō te haere mai. Ko maku mea on tōku I hoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Reflecting these last couple of weeks on the dismay and the distance that we have experienced when on that fateful day earlier this month we clicked on that email that heralded some of Dr. Andrew's highly developed thinking and we felt, oh, I've been trying to figure out what this feeling of distance actually means. What's entailed in it? Is this a marker of our collective ignorance? Is this our shared desire to not know? Or is there a more hopeful interpretation? I've gone with the hopeful. In fact, is not the distance and the dismay some of what we felt, even if only microscopic? Is it not something of a sign, and no doubt one of the last signs, and Dr. Andrew will speak to this, of what it is to be human? How? The Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, thank you. He speculates that we will lose our humanity when we're faced with the prospect of a direct link between our brain and the digital network. When this happens, we will lose the basic distance, hear that? Which makes us human. The distance between external reality and our inner life, where we can think what we want. With my thoughts, I can directly intervene in reality. And then to demonstrate some of this freedom of thought that makes us human, when asked by The Economist in this interview, do you want a new master? The radical philosopher responds with this. Surprisingly, yes, I do want a new master. But what kind of master? We usually see a master as someone who exerts domination, but there is another more authentic sense of a master. A true master is not an agent of discipline and prohibition. His or her message is not you cannot nor you have to, but a releasing you can. What? Do the impossible, i.e., what appears impossible within the coordinates of the existing constellation. And today, this means something very precise. You can think beyond capitalism and liberal democracy as the ultimate framework of our lives. Now, to help explore some of this challenge of the distance that we have felt with this particular issue, some of what it says to our collective freedom, some of what it even says of giant otters, that's what I promised you'd be speaking of, but also the freedom that we have to think that we can in fact think beyond capitalism and liberal democracy. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Shepherd to Thought Matters tonight.
I'll wipe the smile off my face to start. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko wai te maunga, ko makarora te awa, ko wanaka te roto, ko makarora toku kāinga I nei ko anaru ahau. I live in a place down in near Wanaka, right beside the Southern Alps of New Zealand, and I have lived there for the last 12 years. In January I'll be shifting here to Wellington to return to my roots because I grew up here in Wellington. It's really lovely to be here. I was here 2 years ago to speak at a Thought Matters. It was a Thought Matters conference, and have some familiar faces of people I met then at the time. Thanks for coming out on a Thursday night in spring to hear either about otters, and I'm sorry if you came thinking you were going to hear about otters. And I'm sorry if in reading the abstract that if you were confused. Malcolm has just wondered about why that might be, and maybe it was simply because it was a very academic abstract and you looked at all the complicated words. So actually probably the failing is more with myself. Thanks for the introduction, Malcolm. And I'm rapt. We must have been talking even though we weren't talking. Because in many ways that final conversation, that final quote around liberal democracy and capitalism and thinking beyond that framework is hopefully where I'll end up by the end of this evening. So to kick it off, what I'm going to do actually is start though with a biblical passage that you will know very well. And this, Stuart, where are you? Is it there? Do I just... Oh, look, there we go. So, sorry, no, you don't need to do that, Stuart. So commodification, and I'll come back to the word of commodification in a minute. Commodification of the world and self, the freedom to flourish in the age of the Anthropocene. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let there be signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." and there was evening, and there was morning, the 5th day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. Obviously a deliberate attempt to help us reflect on something of rethinking that creation narrative. We have indeed lived and multiplied and filled the earth. The previous slide will tell you something of the rise of the human population. And as we have grown, we have become more voracious in our appetite of chewing through natural resources, as we call them. Perhaps some further information to illustrate some of these slides. %40 of global land use is for human agriculture. 16 million square kilometres, which is the equivalent to the continent of South America, is for croplands, for wheat, soybean, corn and rice. But 30 million, which is double that, which is equivalent to the continent of Africa, is used for pasture lands. 1/2 of the current human population lives in cities, but our global agricultural footprint is 60 times larger than our urban footprint. We currently use 50% of available global freshwater supplies for agriculture. We use 50%, and 70% of this is used for agriculture. Annually, 18.7 million acres of forests are cleared for agriculture, equivalent to 27 soccer fields every minute. Mainly for cattle ranching, especially in the Amazon, which has been in the news recently, or closer to home, palm oil plantations in Southeast Asia. And I think the news this week was about Indonesia having a red haze again because of burning. 30% of global greenhouse gases stem from global food production. 1/3 of the world's arable land has been lost to soil erosion or pollution in the last 40 years. And we're losing fertile soil at the rate of 24 billion tonnes a year. It takes 5,000 years to generate 2.5 centimetres of topsoil under normal agricultural conditions. So when you're losing 24 billion tonnes, you're facing a big problem. So that's some sort of illustration around that sort of reality. 30% of the world's fisheries are at the moment being fished beyond their biological limits. Some scientists, and in fact many of them, believe that current rates of commercial fishing will mean that fishing has collapsed. Commercial fishing collapses by 2050. Approximately 3 billion of the world's population rely either on wild or farmed seafood as their primary source of protein. Biodiversity. Some of you will have heard the phrase that we live in the 6th great mass extinction, recognising that there have been 5 other great mass extinctions during the fossil record. We're coming into, or most biologists say that we are now on the threshold, or that we've well and truly entered into a 6th great mass extinction in terms of loss of species. While the human population of 7.6 billion represents only 0.1% of all living things, since the emergence of us as a species, Homo sapiens, our actions have led to the extinction of 83% of all wild animals, 80% of marine mammals, and 50% of plants. Obviously, extinction is a normal part of an evolutionary process, but our current rates of extinction are, depending on who one reads, somewhere between 100 and 10,000 times higher than the background extinction rate. We live, therefore, in a current reality where 96% of mammals on Earth are livestock for human consumption, 4% are wild, where 70% of the birds on this earth are either chickens or other poultry, and 30% are wild. Oh, that did work. That was me, sorry. That's what happens when you put a neo-Luddite machine. For those who are more into sort of graphs, this is important work done by a Swedish research institute, Rockstrom, and it came out 10 years ago, and this has become this key piece of work in terms of discussing how we're overshooting planetary boundaries. And so it breaks up the world into sort of key boundaries that we have in terms of the biophysical planet that we live within, and then talks about what are the boundaries within which humanity needs to live to keep an ecosystem or keep the planet functioning as it currently does. All of this you've heard all before. It's very hard to not open a newspaper or turn on the television without recognising that we live in a time of ecological crisis. Unlike other crises, this crisis isn't going to go away, it's just going to deepen. The reality of the changing context we are in is such that recently geologists have talked about rethinking the time that we live in geological history. And so there's a movement at the moment amongst geologists to say that we've entered the Anthropocene, not the Holocene, which is known as the recent period, but the Anthropocene. The reason for that is their argument is that in the future, when geologists come back to look at rock strata, they will look back at the rock strata and they will try to understand what is the key factors that have shaped the data that we're seeing now in front of rocks. Is it because of volcanism? Is it because of an asteroid impact? Is it because of acidification? What has taken place here? And they say that the key pieces of evidence will be chicken bones and plastic. that the fact that we eat 70 billion chicken a year as a human species and our obsession with plastic means that all those will be in the fossil record. And so we will look back and people will say, well, there's something taking place here. This is evident here in the fossil record. And so they've suggested that we live in the Anthropocene. And maybe the best way to think about the way in which we have multiplied and spread is to think about the extremes of the world that we live in. The Mariner Trench is 11 kilometres undersea. And earlier this year in May, Victor Velasco descended 11 kilometres in his submersible. And at the bottom of the Mariner Trench, he discovered 4 new species of shrimps and a plastic bag. 9 kilometres up on top of Mount Everest, this is an image from the human detritus that was picked up from expeditions in 2010 and gathered in one place to bring off the mountain. And so everywhere on this planet now, there is evidence of our existence. What has caused this? How have we come to this situation that we are currently in the 21st century? Wendell Berry, who is an American tobacco farmer from Kentucky, and also an essayist and a poet who I enjoy reading, says, quote, "The environmental crisis has happened because the human household of economy is in conflict at almost every point with the household of nature. We have built our household on the assumption that the natural household is simple and can be simply used. We have assumed increasingly over the last 500 years that nature is merely a supply of raw materials and that we may safely possess those materials merely by taking them." Berry, I would suggest, makes 2 important observations here. The first is that he argues that the issue here is a question of economics, in particular how our prevailing economic systems and practices run counter to the underlying systems that sustain our biophysical world that we live in. But secondly, he makes a telling comment here around history. He seems to suggest that this has always been the tendency, but that it has been ramped up particularly during the last 500 years. Others have followed Berry recently in arguing that indeed our current moment of geological history perhaps is not best defined as the Anthropocene, but, they provocatively suggest, as the Capitalism. It is, they argue, the emergence and the dynamics of globalised capitalism that have shaped the realities of our planet today. Now, as an aside, I want to suggest that actually I think both of these things are true, that Wendell Berry is correct, and there's something about our human capacity to extend ourselves, to overreach. And it's worthwhile reading a book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, where he looks at previous human civilizations and how they have collapsed because they've overreached their ecological resources. But the reality is we don't live in the past, we live in the present. And so as we grapple with the present crisis we're in, our job is to discern the times that we're in. We need to consider the economic milieu within which we live and breathe, and in particular how the words freedom and flourishing are defined and understood in our current socio-economic political paradigm. So I finished my first section here, and now I'm going to, if you're thoroughly bored with the ecological analysis, I'm now going to move on to other big words here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what is also becoming a debated word now, which is neoliberalism, which is the economic paradigm which has sort of dominated economic doctrine in the last 40 years. Influential writings of Milton Friedman and other Chicago economists, which were made real through people like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and our own Roger Douglas and the Labour government in 1984. Neoliberal economic doctrine argued for the freeing of global markets, for tariffs to be removed, to allow capital to move freely around the globe, It argued that free markets were the most efficient at deciding where money should be invested and what products should be produced, etc., and that the government or the state should stay out of the marketplace. It also argued that private companies, which were driven by profit, were more efficient than state-owned enterprises, and thus, we've lived in this era, we will have seen the selling off for public utilities and the privatisation. Friedman and other neoliberal economists saw freedom of markets and individual and democratic freedom as inextricably connected. They argued that genuinely free economic markets would lead to the emergence of democracy. Hence the stress in the late 80s, early 90s, as the USSR opened up, was that its opening up of the markets had to go hand in hand with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, driven by this belief that free markets would lead to the birth of the spirit of democracy, as famously argued by the US theologian Michael Novak. 30 years later, one does not hold those same views quite so strongly, I suspect. Milton Friedman argues in a book called Capitalism and Freedom in 1962, when he first was fleshing out these ideas. He says, so long as effective freedom of exchange is maintained, the central feature of the market organisation of economic activity is that it prevents one person from interfering with another with respect to most of his activities. The consumer is protected from coercion by the seller because the presence of other sellers with whom he can deal. The seller is protected from coercion by the consumer because of other consumers to whom she can sell. The employee is protected from coercion by the employer because of other employers for whom they can work, and so on. And the market does this impersonally and without centralised authority. Anyone here who has done some economic reading here will recognise the extent to which Friedman takes the writings of Adam Smith from the 18th century, 17th century and sort of reworks these. But central to his theory of market freedom is the idea that any bilateral transaction between people needs to be voluntary and it needs to be informed. William Kavanagh, in a book called Being Consumed, suggests that there are two corollaries that follow from this idea of voluntary informed exchange. The first thing is that Friedman conceives of freedom negatively. That is, freedom is an absence of interference from others. That's an important point to make. In this way of thinking, freedom is conceived of negatively as absence of interference from others. And the second point that Kavanagh suggests is that free market thinking such as this, there is no telos or common end or goal to which the market is directed. Rather, each individual chooses his or her own end or goal. Whereas in previous societies, economics or economic systems were enmeshed in a broader social vision, by the late 20th century, when Friedman's ideas were taking hold, liberal thought had reached its logical conclusion, which is what matters is the choice of the individual and the individual. Accordingly, following this to its logical conclusions, freedom is the freedom of the individual to have autonomy. It's conceived of negatively as the absence of interference from others, and is expressed in a consumer capitalistic culture by the freedom to consume and purchase the products that one chooses as an individual. Underlying this anthropology, this way of thinking about ourselves as humans, underlying this economic theory is an anthropology, which is that of the liberal individual. A focus on the rights of the individual to live according to their desires, as long as they don't impact on others, but also a very atomised understanding of what it means to be human. As Margaret Thatcher would once quip, there is no such thing as a society. There is no such thing as a society. You are just a collection of individuals. Likewise, in such a system or in such a mode of thinking, we have to understand what that means to think of flourishing. Within such a cultural milieu which we live, flourishing is primarily conceived of as the removal of barriers, restraints and limits to economic trade. In other words, a form of free market fundamentalism. Flourishing is the access of more of the human population to these markets. And obviously the argument was that with that would come the spreading of democratic ideals. And flourishing is expressed in consumer capitalism by growing profits of capital, which are then reinvested to make more profit, the multiplication of individual consumer choices, and in particular the growth of products. More and more areas of human life, of our culture, can be commodified, that is turned into commodities or products that can then be sold in the marketplace. And finally, flourishing within such a framework is understood as endless, limitless, ongoing economic growth. Again, there are some underlying assumptions here about the way humans engage with the rest of the world or the rest of creation. Underlying this is an assumption that of a utilitarian understanding of creation. The earth and all its inhabitants, non-human inhabitants, are purely seen as natural resources that can be commodified and brought into the market. And there's the underlying assumption on the limitless nature of nature. That will never end. Finally, the telos or the social goal of this, the endless growth of consumer products and increasing standards of living. If all of that was a bit difficult to understand, another way to think about it is Max Oschlager's talks about the dominant social matrix. And he suggests that we live in a period of history, within the Western world particularly, where our understanding of nature has become instrumental. That is, we are purely anthropocentric. We see ourselves at the centre and nothing else matters. Short-term economic interests dominate over long-term intergenerational equity. Economics is boiled down to being measured purely in a monetary term, with no regard for ecological health and well-being. Limitless growth is possible due to the wonders of engineering. Ecological damage caused by this project of global consumer capitalism can be solved and will be mitigated by human ingenuity. And finally, free markets and democratic societies will ensure the emergence of the appropriate technology engineering to solve the ecological problems. The difficulty is that slowly this narrative is being picked apart, as we're becoming increasingly aware that the assumptions that underpin this way of thinking are deeply, deeply, deeply flawed. First, the problem is that we realise that neoliberal economic ideology works fine as an abstract economic theory, but it doesn't actually work like that in a real world. We know that existing inequities and asymmetries within the system, which are historical, geographic, gender, race, or about military power, mean that human exchanges are never truly free in an abstract theoretical sense. Maybe in an abstract theoretical sense. But there is always some element of coercion taking place. i.e., is the person choosing to sell one of their kidneys really entering into a voluntary, informed decision of mutual benefit? Does having the choice of Pepsi or Coke when one's water supply is contaminated by industrial activities upstream a choice of free individuals? How can we speak of global free markets when the freedom of labour to travel and cross borders doesn't exist? How does the consumer have freedom to choose when there is a monopoly in place? Indeed, anti-globalisation arguments have focused on the inherent injustice within global economic systems where non-industrialised nations who have endured often centuries of slavery and colonisations have been drawn during the last 30 or 40 years into a global economic system and been forced, with the unquestionable doctrine of neoliberal economic theory held over them, into yet another form of economic bondage, reduced to cheap labour and their land and natural resources reduced to commodities for the growing markets. So as well as that historical background, the second problem with this theory, or this, is that we recognise increasingly the inequity that has resulted from the system. This is a recent report which has come out looking at world wealth population. Oxfam's way of telling it might be slightly more graphic, which is that there are 8 billionaires in the world at the moment who own the same wealth as 3.6 billion people. And of course, you may read the news recently about during the Davos forum where Google ran a forum. Did people read about this? And gathered some of the world's celebrities and wealthiest people to come and discuss world poverty, and they flew in on their corporate jets to have that conversation about how together they could help to bring about ecological justice in the world. Thirdly, and most critically, during the last half century, and especially during the last 2 decades, we are increasingly aware of another fundamental flaw in this economic theory, which is ecological limits. So, that's all very bleak. How do we respond? If the first half was an analysis of the world that we live in, the second half, which actually will only be about probably 15 minutes, I want to explore what this might mean for us as faith communities as we seek to be the body of Christ incarnated in our communities. How might we offer a biblical vision, to quote Zizek via Malcolm, which helps us to see our way beyond a framework of capitalism? Oh, we'll go back to that. We've had a light break here, and do I need you to press that, Stuart, or is that going to work? Back one more, and then press again.
Baby Daniel is just waking up. He's gonna win a state championship one day. This guy, he'll run a marathon. Whoa, you, man. Me? She is gonna have the best swing in the state.
Who, me?
Yep, that's right. She will totally win the City Open tournament.
Get out!
Oh my God, you get out. All of these athletes are terrible now, but they'll all do big things one day. But this is where everyone reaches their athletic peak. Go, Barry!
Get up! I'm winning!
Be cool, Barry. Be cool. 1 year ago, I said she would score every time she had the ball. And guess what?
Now I score every time I get the ball.
I know. When everyone pushes their limits, they reach their maximum potential and they live happily ever after.
I'm not done. Hey!
No, you're done.
Hey.
That's a wrap. Oh, come on. That was my tagline. Hey, story's over. What are you doing? Oh, whoa, he is going to kill you. And your mother's gonna kill me.
I'm gonna kill you!
So sorry, man. What are you doing?
Said I can do amazing things.
Well, I didn't mean jump off a friggin' cliff.
I've never lost.
Kid, you can't out-sprint a sprinter. You can't either. Zach, what are you doing on top of that van? Aaron, what are you guys doing?
Watch this.
What? I can't take it. Neymar, whoa! That is humiliating on so many levels. Ooh. Giancarlo! Serena, what kind of training is that?
Excuse me?
So sorry. Nigel, that is so unnecessary. Whoa, Tim, you can't be the star of every sport.
Yes, he can.
Come on!
Let's do this.
No, let's not do this. Run! Everybody is going way too far. Hello? Why is no one listening to me? You too, Mo. Stop. The race is over, man. Oh, kid, no, kid, please don't do this.
I got this.
This is out of control.
Baby Daniel is just waking up, but he'll do big things one day. Because when everyone pushes their limits, they reach their maximum potential and they live happily ever after. The story's over. I didn't mean jump off the cliff. What are you doing? Let's not do this. Run. Everybody is going way too far. Why is no one listening to me? The race is over. Kids, please don't do this. This is out of control. Anyone listen to Greta Thunberg's speech the other day to the UN? Same sentiments. Freedom. Redefining freedom. Limits and boundaries is what gives space for freedom to exist. Freedom is not living without limits. It is the very structure of limits and boundaries which creates space for life to exist and develop and flourish. It is the boundaries created by the Creator which keep the sea of chaos in Genesis at bay and allow life to emerge. But the seas of chaos are always threatening. The Nike video tells us to live unlimited, to breach those boundaries, to let loose chaos. Our postmodern narratives of our age tell us that joy and playfulness of such chaos leads to wonderful outcomes. But what happens for those downstream from the flood? Or in our case, caught on low-level Pacific islands or the delta of the Pacific as sea levels rise? This may all sound conservative. Maybe I'm becoming middle-aged. But the reality is that throughout human civilization, moments of chaos have always been carefully constructed, i.e. the Middle Ages, the carnival. It was the overturning of roles and the positions in society for a day. It was a letting off of steam. It was a restarting. But still, there was a protection of some sort of societal framework and common dream and vision that provided the conditions for life to flourish. Practically, we live with limits and boundaries. I drive my car on the left-hand side of the road. The tourists where I live also drive on the left side of the road, but normally coming head-on towards me. I'm married and have been for 14 years. I limit myself to one partner so that my life will flourish. There are consequences of eschewing all boundaries and stepping over the limits. We see this in Scripture constantly. Genesis 2, the story continues. Humanity is placed within a temple garden to till and keep. Religious language, the same commandments of care for the Lord's temple. It is a sacred act. But again, there are limits established. Genesis 3, we choose to step over those limits, and in doing so, we cut ourselves off from other creatures and from other humans. We become alienated. We are put outside of that temple garden. Perhaps most graphically in the Genesis story, the flood narrative, where human violence towards the other, both fellow humans and the earth, puts all of the earth at risk. And so the sea of chaos is let loose by God. The earth is returned to the chaotic void before it is rebirthed. You might want to read the text, which is an utterly biocentric text. One family which is kept alive, along with all other species. Secondly, as well as limits, we are going to have to redefine, the necessity of limits. We're going to have to redefine freedom as interdependency, not autonomy. You might want to think about where the words free come from. In Old English, it comes from the idea of being not in bondage or acting for one's own will. But more intriguingly is its Proto-Germanic roots, where the word to be free is linked closely with the idea of being beloved. So to be beloved and to not be in bondage. The verb to free means in Old Germanic to make free, but to court, to woo. To be free is to be in love with someone. So in both of these senses, there is a dual sense that to be loved and to be free, to be the beloved and to be a friend, are closely connected. Unlike the Nike video where we see individuals rising to the pinnacle of their success, which of course ignores all the people behind them, such as their parents who drive them back and forth to practices. This is the story of my life with young kids now. Or coaches or supporters. it's actually those communities that sustain and allow those individuals to flourish. Freedom ultimately, therefore, is not isolation from others, but rather it is being tied to others by bonds of love, compared to neoliberal thought, which suggests that freedom is from the other. The biblical vision is that freedom is for the other. Finally, redefining flourishing. The word flourish is an ecological term. It comes from the old French floris, to blossom, to flower, to bloom, to prosper, or from the Latin florere, to bloom or to blossom or to flower. Economic flourishing and flourishing of human communities is inextricably connected to the flourishing and health of ecosystems. Recent work has been going on and taking Rockstrom's thinking around ecological boundaries and then blending that with sustainable development goals and suggesting that we might want to think of economics as donut economics, which is that we have a biological ceiling, which is the outside of the donut, but we also have a social foundation, which is the inside of the donut. And that to meet our sustainable development goals, which is inside the donut, we have to make sure that we also don't go over the outside of the donut. Those things are inextricably connected. Ecological well-being and health, social well-being and health. Hang in there, almost done. What does this mean practically? Boiling this all down, what does this mean for the nitty-gritty of our lives? What is understanding freedom as requiring limits and involving relationships that tie and bind? And what does understanding flourishing in a broader ecological sense mean practically for our day-to-day economic choices? I want to suggest that we live in a culture of detachment and alienation. We've become used to being alienated and detached from place. We often talk about homes as properties rather than homes, or we talk about our houses as properties. From products, packaging and disposability, plastic issues, from our exchange partners. We don't know the people that we purchase our goods from. We have no idea who has been involved in making that. And from nature, we spend most of our time, or large amounts of our time, particularly in the Western world, staring at a screen rather than staring at the world around us. William Kavanagh says, in consumer culture, dissatisfaction and satisfaction ceases to be opposites. For pleasure is not so much in the possession of things as in their pursuit. There is a pleasure in the pursuit of novelty, and the pleasure resides not so much in having as in wanting. Once we have obtained an item, it brings desire to a temporary halt, and then the item loses some of its appeal. Possession kills desire. Familiarity breeds contempt. That is why shopping, not buying itself, is the heart of consumerism. The consumerist spirit is a restless spirit, typified by detachment, because desire must be constantly kept on the move. And if you get a chance, it's worth reading Kavanagh's book called Being Consumed and reflecting on the extent to which advertising links into creating desire. What does it mean for our faith communities to enact a new economy, to share communal practices which shape our lives communally but as individuals? To create people who are attached and affectionate, to create hope in response to the denial and the apathy that pervades our age. I'm going to race past that. I want to suggest a few quick things here in ending. One is around limits, about how this may work out. What does it mean for us as communities to celebrate simplicity, to develop a theology of enough? What does it mean to be downwardly mobile? To say, yep, I've set my standard of living. In October the 1st, I start a new job with the University of Otago, and for the first time in my life, I will receive a salary that I won't be working out, how am I going to pay the bills this year? And I look at that salary and I think, whoa. And someone said to me, actually, Henry, that's not a very big salary at all. That's just kind of normal. But for me, I'm just like, wow, what am I going to do with that? It's more money than I need. And so as a family, we'll sit and have a conversation around, well, are we going to peg our standard of living to the way we've lived, which is we've been quite comfortable with, or will our standard of living going up because our income has gone up? And there's an economic law for that, and unfortunately that's the nature of the world, which is as our incomes go up, so does our standard of living, so does our levels of consumption. An interesting person to read on this would be Wesley, who very early in his life lived on an Anglican stipend. And then as his royalties started coming in from his books, he kept the same standard of living. He pegged it to inflation and kept the same standard of living, and every other cent he earned, he gave away. What limits are we going to set around our carbon footprints? Are we going to determine this is my carbon footprint and I'm going to stay at that carbon footprint, and then have to make hard decisions? And unfortunately I don't have it with me, but there's a wonderful book written by a father and son from Australia who were missionaries with servants for many years living in the slums in India, called Living a Carbon Lifestyle, where they've chosen to come back to Australia and see if they can peg their carbon footprint to the same as what they lived in the slums, with great difficulty. Patterns of consumption, responding to alienation and detachment by creating a culture of attachment and affection. How might that shape the choices that we make around our consumer products? Repair, reuse, reduce, recycle and upcycle, connection with our local economies, seasonal food, packaging, fair trade, ethical consumption. There's heaps and heaps and heaps here, but I'm just going to touch on this because we can open this up to conversation. Energy consumption, travel, how, why, where do we invest our money, etc. While I'm plugging books, there's an excellent book here. This, I don't know if it's one or it's a contender for the Australian Christian Book of the Year, written by a friend of mine called Jonathan Cornford, who's based in Australia, called Coming Home, Discipleship, Ecology and Everyday Economics, where he takes a whole lot of those ideas into the nitty-gritty and breaks down. There's a study guide to it to say what does this mean for the communities that we're part of. Finally, what might it mean for us to explore different ways of thinking about exchange? In our current economic climate, an exchange only has value if it is quantified in monetary terms. But how can we reorientate our thinking as communities of faith to recognise that transactions or exchanges that take place within the household have value even if money is not attached to it? And how do we recognise, therefore, and empower those who have perhaps the least to offer in a financial economy, but actually arguably the most to offer in a genuine economy of freedom and flourishing? What might it mean to think about community banks, saving pools, credit unions, complementary currencies of exchange such as time or barter? For local community practices such as farmers markets or CSAs, the community sustainable agricultures, cooperatives, collective business models. How might the church do this both within its own community but also on a more global level? And finally, how do we create a culture of attachment and affection for the habitats, for the ecosystems that we are embedded in and upon which our lives depend? There's a whole conversation in this. How well do you know your home? How many of you can name your bird species? How many of you know the name of the local river that runs outside your core headquarters? How many of you know what native species live there or what the endemic species are? Worth thinking through. All of which means that my little postscript, which was discussing the age of surveillance capitalism, I will have to leave for another time, where we discuss the fact that capitalism is now entering a new phase as well. And actually what's being commodified is us. Google and Facebook and the technologies now have moved on so that actually what is being commodified is us. Every time we're online, the data that we are producing is being captured and is going into massive algorithms, and those algorithms are then being used to tell us, to shape us, to become consumers of products which are sold to us. That has massive implications Shoshana Zuboff argues this is just the next stage of capitalism. Once you have raped and pillaged the earth of its natural capital, you turn to the next available thing that you can commodify, and that's us, human beings. Thank you for listening. Hopefully you understood a lot of that without dictionaries. I'll open up for questions.